Spoiler alert, Dynasty Warriors 4 is where the series gets really, really good. The title was reviewed favorably by critics and users alike at the time. But how has the game held up? Let's find out. Dynasty Warriors 4 was released in 2003, about 2 years after its predecessor. Once again, you follow the story of one of a plethora of characters aligned with one of the three kingdoms, the Wei, Wu, or Shu, in the 2nd century of China known as the Three Kingdoms period. The plot very loosely follows the dramatized novel of the period's chaos and intrigue known as the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Koei had already started deviating quite significantly in Dynasty Warriors 3's story, however, and the 4th entry continues this, making its own versions of all the famous characters of the time, such as Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and Lu Bu. I generally feel that Koei's versions of the characters are not as well designed as their counterparts from the novel, but they do a good enough job of giving the characters just enough unique personality to get to the real gem of the series, its gameplay.
Prepare to meet your doom!
Dynasty Warriors 4's gameplay is nothing short of a masterpiece. Everyone plays so tightly, and movesets feel perfected coming off of Dynasty Warriors 3. There are an immense amount of small improvements that add up to make Dynasty Warriors 4 exude that fine-tuned, ultra-high level of polish that the Musou gameplay is known for. Similar to the last game, you take on the role of one of over 40 iconic characters to mow down hundreds of enemy soldiers in famous battles from the Three Kingdoms period in China. This game includes 3 wholly new characters representing each of the 3 major factions, including Yue Ying, the brilliant wife of Zhuge Liang, Cao Ren, cousin of Cao Cao and a Wei general of considerable importance, and Zhou Tai, an absolute beast of a Wu warrior that also happens to be one of the 2 characters in the game that can play semi-competently on horseback. Although 3 is not a considerable amount of new players, these characters would all become staples of the Dynasty Warriors series, and the cast is more than large enough to contain plenty of variety. To start things off, we finally have markers for generals on the minimap. No longer do you have to pause the game non-stop to see where all the map's major enemies are. This unfortunately doesn't yet cover officers under generals as well, but it does make gameplay feel considerably smoother. There's also been tremendous fine-tuning of mounts in the game, which can now also be seen on the minimap. You no longer have to stop moving to dismount a dashing mount, ranks are no longer required to ride on the better mounts in the game, and items can be picked up without dismounting your horse at all. Also unlike in previous games, running into a bodyguard or general while on your mount no longer stuns your movement. In fact, running by allies no longer stuns them at all, making traversing a level significantly less annoying now. It really does help the game feel considerably more fluid than it did previously.
Now there is no way that we can fail.
Guard captains that protect enemy spawn points no longer drop skill boosters in Dynasty Warriors 4, instead opting to drop items such as meat buns which restore your health. I actually think this method works better now than how it previously worked, and it's nice to plan when you want to take out a control point in the case your health does begin to drop. Generals and officers are now the sole enemies that drop stat boosters, including drops that increase your attack and defense. Additionally, a single hidden drop for a health and Musou boost can be found in each stage. When meeting an enemy officer or general on the battlefield, there's now a chance that you can be challenged to a one-on-one duel, more akin to the gameplay found in the original fighting game Dynasty Warriors 1 or Sangoku Musou. I really like the duel system, and wish that they would have kept it in later entries in the series. Although they can feel very cheap at times, with enemies dealing out significantly more damage than you can, randomly restoring full health, and unleashing Musou attacks back to back, it was a great concept and really increased the skill ceiling of Dynasty Warriors 4. Defeating officers in duels would grant your force a considerable morale boost, a mechanic in the game that essentially makes a force fight better or more poorly depending on whether their morale was high or low. Turn down the duel, and your force takes a morale loss. Lose, and it's game over. The combat system in Dynasty Warriors 4 is very similar to the 3rd entry in the series, with several far-reaching improvements. You still frame your attacks around a 4 to 6 hit combo that can be changed by using a charge modifier. Attacking and taking damage still increases your Musou meter, which when full allows you to discharge a devastating Musou attack. You also still block, jump, and guard just as in previous games. Charge modifiers have now been streamlined, with character combos feeling much tighter than previously. C1 attacks are now unique to each character, and C3 attacks, where you hit with 2 normal attacks followed by a charge, are now multi-hitting attacks that can be followed up with several additional jabs by continuing to hit the charge button. which sometimes has the ability to stun or stagger enemies on contact. This undoubtedly increases the depth of the core fighting mechanics, making certain moves more or less advantageous given the situation that you're in. Jumping charge attacks are now also available, where you can dive into enemies, which often emits an area of effect attack that may launch enemies on hit. You can now turn a full 360 degrees while aiming your bow, instead of being limited like in previous games. Targets further away can now also be zoomed in on, and the enemy AI has been improved to try and strafe or move laterally when you're shooting at them. Speaking of improvements to enemies, generals can be powered up in a hyper mode, where they exude an aura of lightning and have heavily powered up stats, regardless of the state of their forces' morale. This became a staple of the series, where enemy commanders or generals that were instrumental in certain battles are considerably more difficult to defeat than other enemy officers. You can now parry enemy attacks in-game by pressing the charge button while blocking, right when an enemy attack connects. This allows characters to dodge an enemy attack and immediately triggers a counterattack that comes with the added bonus of a few invincibility frames during the animation, allowing you to block other enemies during combat very temporarily. I love the addition of this mechanic. It's useful in so many situations, and practically vital in duels and on the game's hard mode for unlocking secret weapons and items. You can also now announce yourself in battle by pressing R3. This emits a shockwave that staggers nearby opponents, allowing you to open up enemies to your combos. The attack is great for guard-breaking officers that can't be opened up in other ways, or dismounting enemy units. It also can emit a small amount of damage, although it will not KO your opponents on its own. The game's story is told in its Musou mode. Unlike in previous games, the mode now focuses on one of several kingdoms, instead of the individual characters. This includes the 3 major kingdoms, as well as other factions such as the Yellow Turbans, the Nanman, and the forces under Lu Bu. I like that the game now has the ability to change characters out for all the different stages, and that there wasn't a need to pad out a single character's story in order to allow them to have a full set of stages to go through. It does make it hard to play newly unlocked characters in the game's later stages on the first run, but that is a minor complaint, and I think Dynasty Warriors games are at their best when the story is told in this format. It's just too hard to write compelling stories for 50 plus characters when only given a handful of stages. While the stories do progress in a linear fashion, the player is able to choose whether to join in on optional stages, or what order they want to do a set of stages in. This allowed for consequences in later stages depending on how one chose to progress, and was a nice touch that was sorely missed in later Dynasty Warriors games.
Me and you are more than enough, don't you think, brother?
I would like to agree.
It also allowed for secret stages to be unlocked depending on if certain requirements were fulfilled. There's also substantially more variety in battle goals in Dynasty Warriors 4 compared to its predecessors, with mixed results. Some maps require you to escape a given area, or destroy an escaping carriage, which does mix up the mission gameplay, and frankly, these are a welcome addition to the series. Others, such as breaking 100 boxes in a mission before the time limit runs out in order to find the Imperial Seal, not so welcome. Thankfully, these missions are few and far between. Speaking of some of the story's more negative aspects, shifting the story to be faction-specific rather than character-specific does greatly diminish the story's impact on the game. Although this is a minor gripe considering how the series is primarily focused on its combat. A less excusable aspect of the game's story is that most of the secret missions are just smaller versions of other maps found in the game, limiting the environmental variety. In short, Dynasty Warriors 4's story mode was the best of the series at the time of launch. It's definitely not perfect, but this is Dynasty Warriors. It doesn't have to be.
When will you ever learn?
Sorry.
Well, it's not as if anyone could push you back.
Although Dynasty Warriors 4 does not improve its graphics as significantly as Dynasty Warriors 3 did coming off of the second entry, it does still come with notable improvements. While lag is still persistent in the game, and especially on the PS2 version, it isn't nearly as bad as it was in Dynasty Warriors 3. Although the game still has plenty of hiccups, weird HUD stuttering, and the occasional slowdown, it's perfectly playable nowadays. There's also quite a bit more terrain found in Dynasty Warriors 4. That looks quite good for the time, with foliage littering the outdoor areas in general, boats strewn around marshes and lakes, and weapons scattered across battlefields jutting out of the ground. One thing of note is that the game's color palette has been intensely toned down in comparison to Dynasty Warriors 3. The game just doesn't look as vivid, and while it does come down more to preference, frankly, I miss the lush colors found in the third entry. Still, this is a personal gripe, not a technical one, and objectively Dynasty Warriors 4 is technically superior to 3 in regards to the graphics.
Sweetheart, it wasn't my fault. I'll get him next time, all right?
No, not all right. I'm really getting tired of your excuses.
Dynasty Warriors 4 stays consistent with its predecessors in bringing an amazing soundtrack to the table. Although similar to 3's, the game has a slightly heavier soundtrack, and while it tones down some of the synth, it experiments with bringing in other instruments that feel more appropriate given the game's setting. On top of this, you can now listen to all tracks in the game's option mode. Whether it's better or worse than previous games' music comes down to preference. Either way, it fully meets expectations. Unfortunately, the English version of Dynasty Warriors 4 no longer comes with the Japanese voiceovers. On the bright side, the English voices have been thoroughly improved this time over the 3's, and no longer are you bombarded with the absolute cringe dialogue from the English cast, for better or worse. Like the previous game, Dynasty Warriors 4 ships with a set of additional modes to enjoy during your time with the game. Versus mode returns with a few new twists. Showdown allows you to do a one-on-one against a friend, and was a source of hours of entertainment for me when the game first released. In Encounter, you can duel a friend similar to in Showdown, except the room is barely lit and hard to see with items strewn about. In Influence, you face off against a player character with CPU allies in a 5-on-5 match. And in Escort, you protect your own carriage while trying to destroy the carriage of the other player. It's a really nice mix of modes that can be a lot of fun to play through if you're still able to find someone interested in playing against you. Similarly, co-op returns and is still a blast, and also makes playing on the game's harder difficulty much easier. Challenge mode also returns, with a total of 4 different stages to work through. In Endurance, you try to defeat as many enemies as you can before the time runs out. Time Attack sees you trying to defeat all 100 enemies on a map as fast as you can. Bridge Melee returns, where you try and knock off as many enemies as possible before getting knocked off of it yourself. Finally, in Demolition, you rush through a stage and try to destroy as many objects as possible. Like in previous entries, I never spent too much time in challenge mode. Although they never much interested me, they're nice to have for those of you that want them. You can now also create 4 of your own characters in the game. Players are able to choose either a male or female model and edit the head, chest, arms, legs, and hip equipment of the character, in addition to their equipment color. It's a nice variety, and there's plenty of weapon options to go along with it. In addition to general weaponry such as swords, spears, and pikes, male characters can equip Fushi's greatsword from Dynasty Warriors 3, and female characters can equip Nuwa's rapier. Growing up, I loved the character creator. I made my own cast of characters that I integrated into the story and fleshed out in my own head. Frankly, I think every Musou game should have its own create a character mode, and it made me so happy that they included it in this one. With the exception of secret ultimate weapons, are now leveled up through their own leveling system, as opposed to finding random new weapon drops in-game. Defeating enemy generals, dishing out long combos, or connecting charge attacks on enemies now increases your weapon's experience, allowing your weapons and their connected abilities to evolve over time, and gain better stats and longer combos along the way, instead of randomly finding a better weapon that suddenly increases your character's performance. The more difficult a stage is, whether it being by increasing the game's difficulty or by playing on the later stages in the game, also increases the points gained. The soft maximum weapon level is 9, while the secret 10th level ultimate weapons can be unlocked by completing character-specific objectives on the game's hard mode. There's now a much wider range of mounts that can be equipped. Red Hair, the swift steed of Lu Bu and Guan Yu, returns, as does Liu Bei's Hex Mark, which boosts the rider's luck. Elephants can now also be set as a default mount if you wish to repeatedly experience them in their agonizingly slow and useless glory. Finally, 2 new mounts are found in the game, including Cao Cao's Shadow Runner, a very useful black horse that is near impossible to be knocked off of, and the Storm Harness, a not so useful yellow horse which boosts your mounted attack. It's a nice variety, although I'd only ever considered using 3 of them in normal play. Orbs can now be equipped that add elemental effects to your character's attacks. These include Fire, which damage enemies over time and can stun enemies if taken continuously, Lightning, which causes damage to other enemies nearby the individual first struck, Ice, which can freeze enemies during attacks and thereby stun them for a time, Vorpal, which deals extra damage to generals and may instantly kill non-unique enemies, Blast, which deals extra damage to enemies, and Poison, which drastically lowers enemy defense for a set amount of time after being initially struck. These can be powered up by finding higher level versions dropped by enemies throughout the game. Each element requires a full Musou gauge to activate for most charge attacks, although by equipping a level 10 weapon, this requirement is no longer necessary. Elements are a great addition to the series, and can severely alter how characters play. Items also make a return, which when equipped exert different effects that drastically alter how your character plays. Again, items can be replaced with better versions of themselves when dropped by officers, and several secret items can be unlocked that significantly affect gameplay. As in Dynasty Warriors 3, the game ships with an encyclopedia mode, where you can read quite accurate bios of all unique and generic officers in the game, view character models, and see what items and weapons you've unlocked. This time, you can also read synopses of the greater story of the Three Kingdoms. It's again a nice addition that can provide hours of playtime on its own if you're interested in learning more about the characters. So, to conclude, is Dynasty Warriors 4 worth revisiting now that it's been almost 2 decades since its original launch? As with the other Warriors games of the time, Dynasty Warriors 4 can be bought for very little nowadays. The game was released on the PC, PlayStation 2, and Xbox, and each version has its own benefits and drawbacks. Also, for the record, all footage shown here was captured from the PlayStation 2 version of the game running on a PS3. Ironically, the PS2 version is both the worst version in terms of game performance, with the worst graphics and most lag, yet also the best version in terms of content, with the absolutely stellar Extreme Legends expansion that was released after the initial game's launch. Xbox fares substantially better in performance, yet never received any of the expansions that add to the Dynasty Warriors 4 experience. Finally, an absolutely gorgeous PC version was released under the moniker of Dynasty Warriors Hyper, and had significantly improved graphics over the other versions, as well as no fog of war effects to limit the draw distance, which if I remember correctly led to some pretty comical issues of characters far away standing around doing nothing. Unfortunately, it was never well advertised, and there are currently no legal ways to procure the game. This version also never received any expansion content. I spent hundreds of hours enjoying Dynasty Warriors 4. I counted it among my favorite games of all time for years after its launch, and still come back to the game to this very day. In my opinion, it's absolutely worth playing. No matter which system you choose to grab it on, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this game is nothing short of a Musou masterpiece.
Power and justice can only be attained through victory in battle.
Thanks for tuning into my review of Dynasty Warriors 4. If you like this video, be sure to drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more retrospective reviews of the Musou series. It really helps me out. Let me know your favorite moments from Dynasty Warriors or other Musou games in the comments below. Thanks for watching.